Please welcome your National Association of Realtors President, Vince Malta.
Welcome everyone to our first virtual appraisal summit. We're excited to bring this programming traditionally held in person to so many more of you today. More member engagement overall means more creativity, more ideas, and more voices amplifying our message on Capitol Hill and in state and local governments. Before I continue, just a quick housekeeping note. We aren't using Q&A or chat function for this event, so please just sit back and take in the great information our panelists will provide. While the term realtor tends to be associated with agents and brokers, you, our appraiser members, are an integral part of the realtor family. We rely on appraisers to provide accurate and independent opinions of value that are critical to the real estate transaction. And in 2020, our country and our industry are working through historic events, notably COVID-19 and the racial social justice movements amplifying the issues surrounding fair housing. Today's webinar will focus on fair housing as it affects the appraisal process. It's important for us to get together to have these important conversations, to share information, and to work together to find a way forward. At NAR, we believe that Black Lives Matter, and more than just stating those words, we also believe realtors are the housing industry's obligation for us to actively promote equality, inclusion, and acceptance. It's important that NAR act as a leader, not as a follower, on issues of housing equality and affordability for our industry and for our country. That's why earlier this year, the NAR leadership team passed a Fair Housing Action Plan called ACT, ACT, which stands for Accountability, Culture Change, and Training. Among other proactive steps, the plan calls on us to create minimum core fair housing training requirements for all states, develop a model state licensing law to make sure real estate agents who violate fair housing laws are held accountable. I can tell you that our association's commitment to fair housing has only strengthened in response to the recent racial social justice movements. We have announced a partnership with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce's Equality of Opportunity Initiative as part of a broad national effort to examine economic inequality and advance economic inclusion in America. NAR's chief economist, Lawrence Yun, recently highlighted a number of ideas to help close the persistent gap in homeownership rates. Those ideas include building more homes to increase supply and make it easier to convert from renting to owning, increasing access to down payment assistance, and expanding alternative credit scoring models to include rent and utility payments, adding more positive payment histories to better demonstrate financial responsibility. And these are just places to start the conversation. Meanwhile, our Strategic Thinking Advisory Committee, or STAC, is pivoting to make NAR the leading association in addressing racial inequality. STAC, in collaboration with NAR's Diversity Committee, will propose new policies and programs for empowering diversity in the real estate industry. Other important contributors to this effort will include multicultural real estate groups, large brokerages, local and state associations, other real estate organizations such as the Mortgage Banker Association, and equal rights groups. We're compelled to act because in decades past, realtors helped foster systematic discrimination in housing. We were complicit in the horrible practice of redlining, creating segregated communities that were separate and unequal. The impacts are still felt today and have affected generations. So my fellow realtors, this is the time to step up and lead. Let us work together in stamping out discrimination in housing because it ends with us. Now, before I turn over the mic, I want to thank you for your resiliency in being able to take care of yourselves, your families, and your clients during this pandemic. It's our responsibility as realtors to protect our clients' health and safety at all times by complying with local, state, and federal guidelines, whichever are more strict. The groundwork we lay now through responsible and safe practices will have ripple effects in the months and years to come. Be well, and now I welcome our panel.
Thanks, Vince. Good day, everyone. And again, welcome to the National Association of Realtors Appraisal Summit on Fair Housing Issues in Real Estate Appraisal. My name is Michael Neal, a senior researcher at the Urban Institute located here in Washington, D.C. And I have the distinct pleasure of moderating today's event. We are fortunate to have three panelists with a wealth of experience and knowledge, and I will introduce them in the order that they will present. Dr. Andre Perry, who is a fellow in the Metropolitan Policy Program at Brookings, a scholar in residence at American University, and a columnist for the Hechinger Report. He is the author of the new book, Know Your Price: Valuing Black Lives and Property in America's Black Cities, which is currently available wherever books are sold. Since the COVID-19 pandemic began, Dr. Perry has documented the underlying causes for the outsized number of coronavirus-related deaths in Black communities. His Brookings research has illuminated how certain forms of social distancing historically accelerated economic and social disparities between Black people and the rest of the country. Dr. Perry earned his PhD in Education Policy and Leadership from the University of Maryland, College Park. Mr. Craig Morley, who is a certified general appraiser licensed in Arizona, Nevada, and Utah, with designations from the National Association of Appraisers and the National Association of Realtors. Mr. Morley was appointed to the Utah Appraiser Licensing and Appraisal Board by the governor of Utah starting in 2004 and stretching to 2012, having chaired the board for 4 of those years. Mr. Morley is the past president of the Washington County Board of Realtors, past president of the Utah Association of Realtors, and is currently a director with the National Association of Appraisers. He is also currently serving in the National Association of Realtors Real Property Valuation Committee. Mr. Morley has been a full-time real estate appraiser since 1984 and has been qualified as an expert witness in district court in Utah and Nevada, as well as providing testimony in Georgia, U.S. District Court, and federal bankruptcy courts. Ms. Elizabeth Peets, who is the Vice President of Government Affairs at the Colorado Association of Realtors. Ms. Peets directs the public policy efforts of the Colorado Association of Realtors and manages many functions of the Government Affairs Division, particularly specializing in policy development, advocacy, and legislative affairs. Ms. Peets is a licensed attorney in Colorado, Nebraska, and Washington, D.C. Prior to her current position, Ms. Peets has more than 15 years of experience in government affairs and legal analysis in Washington, D.C. and Colorado. She holds a BA in International Affairs from Colorado University Boulder and a JD from Creighton University. Now, each panelist will give 10 to 15 minutes of remarks, after which I will follow up with a few questions after each panelist has given their remarks, with a few questions to spark further conversation. Dr. Perry, take it away.
Hello. Well, thank you for having me. I really want to thank Vince for that excellent introduction. It's always good to know that an organization as powerful as yours, NAR, is leaning in to racial equality and justice in this country. I want to introduce to you my topic today. I'm going to by sharing a screen, and I will slideshow from the beginning. And I want to just show you a little bit of the data that went into my research on home prices, which is also included in my book, Know Your Price: Valuing Black Lives and Property in America's Black Cities. I'm a fellow at the Brookings Institution, where I study Black majority cities. I look at the assets in them, assets that are worthy of investment, but have not received the proper level of investment because of structural racism. My story begins here in my family home of in Wilkinsburg, Pennsylvania. And you can see that the home that I was reared in is now boarded up. It's essentially owned by the municipality of Wilkinsburg, which is surrounded by Pittsburgh on 3 sides. The home, when I go to it, when I visit it on occasion, I always check the price of it. It ranges anywhere from $15,000 to $20,000 in price, what it's listed at. And when I go look at comparables in the neighborhood, I often wonder how it got so low. But it means a lot. The home means a lot to me. When I was, as the story is told to me, when I was born, the older woman in the right-hand corner, Elsie Boyd, I call her mom, took me in when I was born from the hospital. A deal was made because my mother was very poor. She was probably abused. And she took me, an older brother in. Eventually my younger brother came along. But she raised children in varying durations, some for a few weeks, some would stay our entire through high school till we left for college. But she reared Black kids, white kids, probably between a dozen or 15 or so. So because the conditions during the 70s in Pittsburgh were very harsh, the U.S. Steel left the area, and so did a lot of people. Unemployment was about 20%, which means it was probably 40% for white people, since unemployment is typically double that of whites for Blacks. But my father, one of the reasons why I had to live at 1320 Hill Avenue, he was a heroin addict. He was in and out of prison. And he eventually was killed in prison in Jackson Penitentiary. But I bring all this up because that home that I lived in meant so much to me. But I started just looking at home prices and inconsistencies across the board. Here you can see on this slide that homes in Black neighborhoods are priced lower than those in white neighborhoods. If you look along the x-axis, you see as the percent of Black population increases, the price decreases. So the listing price decreases. So homes where the percentage of the Black population is less than 1% are valued at approximately $340,000, and it's half of that in areas that are 50% Black or higher. Very linear, and this is across different types of listing prices, whether you're using Zillow or census data. But a lot of people will say that's because of education, that's because of crime, that's because of other factors. Well, those are things we can control for. Those are things we can, and from a statistical standpoint, get at apples to apples comparison. And so that's what we did. We looked at the absolute price difference, we look at structural characteristics, and we controlled for, meaning the size, the number of rooms, the quality per square foot, and we looked at neighborhood amenities, crime, housing, crime, education, walkability, and all those fancy Zillow metrics we see. So we wanted to get an apples to apples comparison. And what we found at homes in Black neighborhoods, homes equivalent to their white counterparts, equivalent neighborhood conditions, are undervalued by 23%, about $48,000 per home. Accumulatively, that's $156 billion in lost equity. And you can see wherever there's a magenta circle, that's where devaluation is occurring. All across the United States, there are places where properties in Black neighborhoods are priced higher, and those are represented by the green circles. As you can see, here are some examples. Lynchburg, Virginia, 81% difference. Rochester, New York, 65% difference. There are places where the homes in Black neighborhoods are priced higher, 10% in Nashville, 23% in Boston. I just want to put this in perspective. 156 billion would have paid for 4.4 million Black-owned businesses based on the average amount that Blacks use to start up their firms. It would have funded more than 8 million four-year degrees. It would have replaced the pipes in Flint, Michigan 3,000 times over. It's 97% of the damage of Hurricane Katrina, and it's doubled the annual economic burden in the opioid crisis. I talked about my father in my book, Know Your Price. I followed where he lived and died, and I found he lived in areas that had significant housing devaluation. And as you know, that's the money municipalities use to fund education, to start businesses, or to fund education, to fund for infrastructure. It's also the money people use, individual homeowners use, to fund education and start businesses. And that led me to this statement, this claim: there's nothing wrong with Black people that ending racism can't solve. That we've got to stop this myth that the conditions of Black cities and neighborhoods are a direct result of the people in them. That is clearly false. We have enough data to show that they're systematically devalued, and there's also recognition that people don't believe in this recognition. In closing, I want to show you my testimony on Capitol Hill, where I testify with members of the appraisal community on this very issue.
If you think Black people are being discriminated when their property is being appraised, would you kindly raise your hand? One person on the panel. If you think that, for fear that I'm not communicating well, if you think that Black people are not being discriminated against when their property is being appraised, if you think they're not being discriminated against, kindly raise your hand. Okay, hands now. We're getting some consternation, I see.
Now, one of the reason why I showed that is there's clearly a disconnect. When we use technology and data to show price differences, we can do that using many different models. But at that hearing, as I was told, people said, I'm not doing anything wrong. And that may be true. But clearly there are practices and belief systems that are influencing the value of home, not just appraisals, lenders contribute, real estate agents contribute to that, but there's something going on in terms of the perception. Our research shows that it's almost like people looking at Black communities seeing twice as much crime, twice as much or worse education, and it's leading to these lower valuations. So I'm going to close there, and I'm going to pass it to Craig. But I'm happy that NAR has joined in this struggle and acknowledged that something's going on, and we all have a role to play in solving for this problem. So I'm going to hand it over to Craig at this point.
Thank you, Dr. Perry. Dr. Perry's study suggests that we have a problem between residential neighborhoods that involve ethnic minorities within the Black neighborhoods versus white neighborhoods. As I prepare my presentation, I'd like to just lay a foundation so that we can kind of understand what goes on in the appraisal process. There's a lot of misunderstandings on what appraisals are and how they're developed. And so in an effort to try to lay some foundation, I would like to first talk about what is an appraisal. By definition, an appraisal is a professional appraiser's opinion of value, and those opinions are developed based on recent sales that most accurately reflect current market conditions. So second, what is an appraiser? An appraiser, by definition, is one who is expected to perform valuation services competently and in a manner that's independent, impartial, and objective based on strict requirements of appraisal standards, commonly referred to as USPAD, and are legally enforceable. If a person is acting as an appraiser and they're not a disinterested, objective third party, they're in violation of their standards. Now, the appraisal committee within NAR has recently been working on a value disclosure document to try to help consumers better understand what some of these different valuation tools are. One of the things that we find is that there's a lot of different valuation models and methods and tools that are there. And so the question that we have to ask ourselves is, what are some of these different valuation things and how do they differ from an appraisal that's developed by an appraiser? For example, what is a Zestimate? A Zestimate is calculated by the physical attributes, tax records, and other user-submitted information. It should be noted that a recent court case, an appellate court, ruled that a Zestimate is not an appraisal. In fact, we don't really know how a Zestimate is developed because it's essentially a proprietary model that is used. And the only reason I mention that is that oftentimes Zillow and values that are developed from some of these models are used, but we wonder about the reliability of the data that's developed from those estimates. So as we do an appraisal, what is value? Now, within the appraisals that are developed by appraisers for federally insured lending institutions, there's a very specific definition of value. And there's basically 5 elements. The first is, are the buyer and the seller typically motivated? Are both parties well informed? Do they have did the property have reasonable exposure to the market? Were payments made to the seller in cash or its equivalent? And did the price represent normal consideration without the influence of concessions? The question is that, can appraisers or the appraisal process itself as employed currently have a material impact on various appraisal neighborhoods? So let's examine the role of the appraiser, the appraisal, and in a typical purchase transaction. Oftentimes there's some confusion about who's the appraiser's client. When we're doing an appraisal for a lender, the lender is the client, not the borrower or the property owner. Within the appraisal terminology, we have intended use. What's the appraisal supposed to be used for? For every federally insured lending transaction where an appraisal is developed, the intended use of the appraisal report is for the lender to evaluate the property that's the subject of the appraisal. And it's not intended for anything else. Who are the intended users? Well, we oftentimes have people use appraisals that are developed by the lender for all kinds of uses, but in reality, the intended user is the lender client, and it's not intended to be used for anything else. So as we examine this, where does the appraisal fit into this whole valuation conundrum that we're seeing in some of these communities? Let's look at who orders the appraisal. Now, I remember back in 2008, the Home Valuation Code of Conduct was put into place. It was later replaced with the Dodd-Frank Act. And essentially what happened is that prior to that time, when we had a collapse in the real estate markets, and we found that there were people ordering appraisals that had a vested interest in the outcome, and they were able to direct who was to do the appraisal, and it put significant influence on that appraiser to try to reach a predetermined value. And when that happened, we discovered that it created chaos in our financial markets. So right now, what happens is when a person is buying a home, the borrower selects the lender that they would like to obtain the loan from, and they either have a direct engagement process from that lender, or an appraisal management company is used to manage the appraisal process. And Usually that takes place after the price has already been established. So usually what's happening is that a listing agent and a selling agent, or the parties that are associated with the transaction, have already been involved in the process to determine which home they would like to purchase, and they negotiate that price based upon the best deal that they can make between themselves. The appraisal may be used to satisfy an appraisal contingency in a purchase agreement, but in reality, that's not the primary intended use of the appraisal. So why do we get appraisals? What are they used for, and how are they developed? Most people look at the appraisal as that final number that is developed as that opinion of value. But as we take a deeper look into what the appraisal does, the appraisal is a tool that is used by the lender to assess the risk in determining the collateral that's going to be used in making the lending decision. And there are a number of elements beyond the value that are considered in making that loan decision. So the first element that the appraisal will analyze is the neighborhood characteristics, land use ratios. Is it a suburban, urban, or a rural area? It'll look at value trends. Are they stable? Are they going up or down? What are the inventories and marketing times looking like? And what are the value ranges within that neighborhood? When the market crashed, the GSEs, the secondary markets, really had no way to analyze the appraisals and the data that was being developed in them. In 2011, the GSEs introduced the Uniform Appraisals, the Uniform Appraisal Data Set, most commonly referred to as UAD, which standardized the way that the appraisals were to be reported to the secondary markets, and it provided a way for that information to be aggregated from those appraisals that were submitted. Now, it's important to realize that the GSEs over the past 9 years or so have collected a massive amount of property data based on the appraisals where that information has been able to be extracted. And the secondary markets have developed these models that they use in underwriting the loan and assigning a risk score associated with the property. Now, oftentimes people don't realize that this data is being used to not only project an expected value before the appraisal is even completed in many cases, but it also has a risk score rating referred to as a CU score. It's developed from the collateral underwriting algorithms that are developed through the GSEs. Now, my experience has been that if you have the CU scores go from 1 to 5, and if you have a CU score that is below 2.5, that usually represents a fairly moderate risk appraisal or moderate risk associated with the property. If you have CU scores that are higher than 2.5, it oftentimes can create some problems in obtaining credit for the purchase of that or in obtaining the loan. The other thing to keep in mind is with this aggregation of data, the GSEs monitor all of the appraisals that are being delivered to them. And if they receive an appraisal where there's a significant difference, either on the comparable data or on the subject data that they have aggregated over time, it's not uncommon for an appraiser to get a little nastygram from the GSE saying, hey, your peers said this was an average quality home. You're saying it's good. What's wrong? They will do that with size and other things. And so the appraiser has to respond to and deal with some of those issues. It's not uncommon for an appraiser to get a call from a lender who's saying, hey, you've got a CU score on this that's higher than we would like it to be, and we would like to try to lower that. The reality is the appraiser has no idea how that CU score is developed, and it may simply mean that that property falls outside the parameters that the secondary markets consider in assessing that risk. Usually what we find is properties that are kind of a one-off or have unique characteristics are difficult to appraise because we don't usually have adequate data to support the market response to some of these unique characteristics. Now, that having been said, and we're talking about the potential of having problems with appraisers appraising properties differently in ethnic or Black communities versus others. So let's look at some of the certifications and requirements that an appraiser is subject to and is legally bound to deal with. In the very first part of the appraisal, there is a note that says race and racial composition of the neighborhood are not appraisal factors. The appraisal itself that's been developed by the GSEs have 25 certifications that the appraiser must certify for, including certification number 7. I selected and used comparable sales that are locationally, physically, and functionally the most similar to the subject. Usually what happens if appraisals have comparable sales or market data that is pulled outside of a market area, that will cause a concern on the part of that lender who is assessing the risk of this property. Certification number 7. I have no present or prospective interest in the property that is the subject of this report. And I have no present or prospective personal interest or bias with respect to the participants of the transaction. I did not base either partially or completely my analysis and or my opinions of market value in this appraisal report on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, age, marital status, handicap, familial status, national origin, or either the prospective owner or occupants of the subject property, or of the present owners or occupants, or in the vicinity of the subject property upon which, or any other basis prohibited by law. So why do I read that long certification? Basically, if an appraiser is found to have violated that certification, they are in violation of their state licensing law, and there is the ability to take action against that person who is in violation. Over the past 15, 20 years, appraisers have seen a more rigorous implementation of prohibited words that can't be used. Essentially, appraisers are really monitored to make sure that words are not used that are suggesting, if not blatantly, subliminally kind of suggesting this is a certain kind of neighborhood. And and in every case where those prohibited words are used, they must be removed. Photograph protocols require that pictures hanging on the wall with people, or other elements that might suggest anything other than neutral information about the property itself either need to be blurred, retaken, or removed. So the conclusion is there is a good deal of oversight by a good deal of oversight over appraisers. The primary element that most of your secondary market lenders want is to have a supported opinion of value and provide credible, consistent data and develop an opinion of value that is consistent with the appraisal standards. Appraisers cannot arbitrarily develop values based on personal preferences. This is due in part to the significant oversight. In fact, Fannie Mae, as I understand it, has about 10% of the appraisals that are sold to them that have some kind of review. Now, as I'd mentioned, there are enforcement mechanisms in place where if bias is detected, there is a protocol or a process in place where appraisers who don't meet those requirements can be disciplined. So let's take an overview. A price is simply an expression that communicates the relative values as reflected by buyers and sellers. Buyers who want to sell or buyers who want to buy and sellers who want to sell. They take into account the available options that are available to them, and they make a purchase decision. This is often done before the appraiser is part of the process. Essentially, appraisers are microeconomists that observe market activity. They analyze the transactional data and base their value on the observations that are developed based on strictly enforceable appraisal standards. So as we look at this problem, and there is a problem, and it's a problem that we need to try to solve. But just as we wouldn't blame the weatherman for bad weather, it's hard to think that an appraiser is responsible for pricing that they have no control over, particularly given the oversight and the requirements that are required by the appraiser. So are there systematic problems within the valuation model as a whole? Well, the reality is I don't know. There might be, but there are a couple of things that we consider. So what are some of the factors? Values as defined are simply an equilibrium point at which where supply and demand meet, and that supply and demand is expressed in a price point that changes over time. Supply and demand are the most significant factors in driving what people are willing to pay for properties. But there are other factors that affect value in addition to income levels. There are many of us who would like to be able to have nicer homes than we have, but are constrained by our income. There's quality of life issues that Dr. Perry has discussed that can have an effect on the desirability of properties in respective areas, and issues associated with quality and condition. And all of those things play a factor in determining what a buyer and seller are willing to pay and receive for a property. So let's look at a couple of things that we might have some issues with. GSEs have analytics in place that hold appraisers accountable. And as part of those analytics, the GSEs have their CU scores that risk properties. The question that we have is, are homes in Black neighborhoods have a higher risk score than white communities? And by having that higher risk score, does it impede the ability of buyers in those neighborhoods to get loans and acquire properties? I don't know, but that's something that we ought to look at. If affordable housing in the United States is a critical problem, we have far more people who would like to get into homes than the housing stock that they can afford to buy is available. So if appraisers were to arbitrarily raise values, if that was even possible, how does that help those people trying to get into housing? Well, the reality is existing homeowners may have more equity of their home on paper, but would that exclude prospective market participants in home ownership? I think you have to conclude it probably would. So how do we solve this gap? I think in order to really understand how to solve this problem, it's essential to understand the cause and effect relationships that factor and drive value. We cannot simply solve a complex problem by appraisers putting higher values in minority areas where the transactional data doesn't support the desired values. So what do? Well, we need to ensure that undue credit restraints are not being put on home buyers in minority neighborhoods. We need to make sure high risk ratings in minority neighborhoods are not excluding would-be home buyers from participating in home ownership. We need to improve resources that allow for home improvement and improve education for would-be home buyers so that they can understand how to qualify for and be responsible borrowers. Bad credit is one of the single biggest restraints for many home buyers in getting into a property. Now, in conclusion, I believe this wealth gap is a serious problem that needs to be addressed. It's my desire that all people who would like to participate in home ownership have the ability to do that, and that we can eliminate all forms of discrimination And I hope that as we participate in this discussion, we can find ways to solve the underlying problem. Thank you so much. Elizabeth, I'm going to turn the time over to you.
All right, thank you, Craig. So I am going to switch gears a little bit now and talk about some of the policy ideas and how we can mitigate some of the problems that our fellow panelists just raised. This has been an interest area for Colorado for a long time. We actually were a pioneer of fair housing law. We, in 1959, became the first state to pass anti-discrimination laws governing private property, a full decade ahead of the Federal Fair Housing Act. And in our association, we are turning 100 next year. And so we are using that opportunity to turn the next century into one for access for home ownership for everyone. And so we have been looking at this issue for a couple of years now. We held a panel on the demographics of home ownership. And it was very interesting what we found. They had a poll and it said 90% of Blacks said that home ownership would be a dream come true, and they were hoping that they could pursue home ownership within the next 2 years. But we also know there are lots of barriers and impediments out there. And we know the home ownership demographics are disparate across all of our different populations. The US average of home ownership is 64%. The LGBT percentage is 49%, whites 72%, African Americans or Blacks 42%, Hispanics 47%, and Asian Pacific Islanders 58%. But when we talked to our members, we asked them, what are the impediments? What are the barriers? And consistently, our African American Black clients said they were concerned about credit history, credit scoring, lower application rates, lower median income, and actually fear and denial in mortgage lending that also showed up in lots of different populations of color. In fact, Forbes said that African Americans were wanting to buy a home were shown 17.7 fewer homes. I know we all know this is a problem, and we're so excited that NAR is taking active steps to mitigate. So I want to talk about 5 different areas where we can actually start trying to implement some policy changes. First, and I know Craig raised this as well, financial literacy and education is critical. Last year in Colorado, we had a bill that would change high school curriculum so that everyone in 9th through 12th grade had to have financial literacy adequacy. They would have to focus on managing credit card debts, the costs of associating or matriculating to post-secondary degree, how to do tax-deferred retirement, and also how to prepare to purchase a home. Unfortunately, that bill didn't go forward because our COVID legislation cycle was shortened. But I think you're going to see us focus in on that again next year. And it's a good bill that lots of different states and local jurisdictions could look at. So feel free to contact me after if you want to see a form of that legislation. But the other thing to think about is it's not just our youth and our younger generation that need to be prepared for home ownership. We also need to be thinking about the community we currently have. So that means meeting people where they are. We need to find those trusted grass tops advocates in our communities who can communicate the information, just as our realtors and real estate agents and appraisers are all those conduits to homeownership. Second, we need to consider holistic family budgeting. So when we go to state capitals, our budget battle shouldn't be in a finite area only in housing. So when we think about a family budget, that covers costs of childcare, costs of transportation, costs of housing, of course, healthcare, food, and educating our children. We should not be fighting other industries to go after a finite amount of budget dollars. And third, this is probably the biggest area here, removing barriers to affordable inventory. And it covers several different sections here. So I'm going to speed through this and hopefully we'll have some time for questions. But when we think about innovation in creating inventory, we need to think through How do we incentivize the market to react and create the product that we want? For example, if you are able to reduce water tap fees or expedite permitting for affordable developments, we might be able to get that product to market quicker. Our home builder colleagues tell us 24% of the cost of bringing a home to market is compliance with regulations. We should consider whether or not some of those regulations that are outside the safety and wellness area are truly necessary. Maybe they could be waived if we're talking about affordable development. Also, we have a really interesting opportunity in a post-COVID-19 environment to repurpose our commercial spaces. Many of our commercial property owners are seeing their properties go down in value. Why would we not think about ideas for either using tax credits or land swaps to give those property owners an ability to trade their land to the city or county government in a way that they could then repurpose into residential housing? Also, when we think about the rent to own time frame, in our state, we heard that it takes about 7 years to save for a down payment. It may vary from state to state, but we should be thinking about policy solutions in that category of that 7-year time frame so that we are actually giving people light at the end of the renting tunnel that moves them along the housing continuum. Can we shorten that 7-year time frame to 3? 2, how do we get that down payment accelerated? Which is also another really important point for us to focus in on. And employers are a huge part of the solution. Not only are they increasingly housing providers that are creating affordable inventory, but they are critical in terms of our down payment assistance. Lots of states have first-time homebuyer savings account programs, and there is a way for us to even accelerate those programs for those that have it. Why wouldn't we let employers match those employee contributions? And this is actually breaking news. Just as of yesterday, there was a federal act in Congress introduced called the American Dream Down Payment Act. This would allow states and local jurisdictions in partnership with their state governments to create 529s for down payments. This is a huge movement forward for us to actually accelerate the savings for millions of Americans. And the other thing that's important in our business sector, I know Vince mentioned this, in partnering with our chamber and our government and business sectors, we need to do a better job of recruiting diversity into our workforces, especially in our high or wage earning sectors such as tech. It's not only a benefit to have a culturally diverse workforce, but it also increases upward mobility when we increase earning power. And then Vince also touched on this. We need to ask some really interesting questions about access to credit. So are there other ways for us to assess whether a person is creditworthy to enter homeownership, whether that's utility or rental payments? But the other thing that's important for us to consider in a post-COVID environment is the home buying process. Can we streamline it from 20 steps to 10 steps? Can we make sure that folks are able to take advantage of the low interest loan rates and refinancing in this COVID period? And then I'm going to touch on 2 more things, and then we'll get to some questions. So I want to talk a little bit about looking forward. How do we plan communities in a way that is very self-reflective of what communities want? Detroit is doing an amazing job of this post-municipal bankruptcy, and they have taken a very unique approach. So what they did was partner with the private sector, government officials, and a robust planning department, and take citizens all around the country and ask them, what kinds of development do you want to see in your community? Then they came back and implemented it with land banks and local neighborhood organizations, and they're investing in individuals who are putting money back into the community. Now, I will say they do need to make sure that they continue that process, because if we don't have individual and citizen-led engagement into our community development, we do face the risk of gentrification, but we can mitigate it, and it is possible. Finally, the last thing I want to touch on is there's a lot of COVID and federal relief out there that went through state legislation and local government processes. And what we need to do, that rental and mortgage assistance is available, but I can tell you, I'm an attorney and obviously in the housing industry, and I don't understand the application and the form that our state housing department just put out. If I don't understand it, how are we expecting average citizens to be able to take advantage of those federal dollars. And those federal dollars have to be spent down by December. So we need to make those forms easier, like a FAFSA, or we need a lot more housing counseling to make sure those dollars don't go to waste. Because the last thing we want is for someone to not continue to have on-time payments, because as we know, as Craig and Andre mentioned, it affects their credit. So in conclusion, I want to say that if we focus on education, focus on adding inventory, increasing earning power, increase the supply of affordable housing, we're going to create the upward mobility that we all need, because we can never lose sight of the individual and the neighborhood approach. As our colleague or former guest speaker earlier this year spoke to us, Doris Kearns Goodwood, empowerment starts from the ground up, and that's where we need to start. I'll turn it back over to Michael for some Q&A.
Thank you very much, Liz. That was really insightful, and just a wealth of information, I think, from each of our panelists. In the final few minutes that we have, I'm going to ask 2 questions, and each of you can decide which or both you'd like to answer. And that is, number one, what is the role of technology in terms of minimizing the racial discrimination with respect to appraisals? And there, I am thinking about kind of the trade-offs between appraisals versus automated valuation models, but there might be other options by which technology can be used as well. And then the second question is kind of thinking about or talking about the status of people of color, specifically Black and Hispanic workers in the appraisal industry. We talk about the impact on Black and Hispanic home buyers, but what's their concentration in the appraisal industry? It is to the degree that there is room for growth. Is there anything that the industry has done or should be doing to expand the profession?
Well, maybe I'll start off. One, I think it's 93% of appraisers are white, and we know that representation matters in everything, particularly in areas that are subjective as appraisals. Now, I will say the range in which people base comps on, there's a larger variance. That data shows this, and it's clear. When it comes to Black neighborhoods, there's a different, the range of comps are different. And it usually reflects a negative value, a negative position for Blacks. Now I say that not to say that, that people are doing anything illegal. Remember, most of our history in mortgaging in the United States, it was legal to segregate. It was legal to discriminate. Redlining established the practice of saying that Black people were deemed too risky. That is fact. What is also fact is that Black people gain less wealth because of that over time. So, and I bring that up because white people in this country, not every white person, but white people in this country are more likely to have wealth. They did not get the home because they were more financially literate. They got it because policy favored them. And if we want to get out of this situation, we've got to see, instead of looking at Black neighborhoods as risky, as seeing people who have been injured by past policy. And so when we do that, the same way we got out of the Depression, when we invested in poor people, we can do that now in areas where there's significant housing devaluation. So and it is easy, just from a tech standpoint, it is very easy to create models to show that there is a much different type of choice of comps when it comes to Black neighborhoods when it then comes to whites. That is easy. I mean, we don't want to get into that debate because we can see that in the data. And if we don't move towards a more democratic system, and it's not just appraisals, appraisers. We're talking about lenders. We're talking about employers. We're talking about a lot of things in the market. If we don't correct it, then we're going to have to lean on technology. And that's not foolproof because the biases of the programmers will show themselves. But the point is, if you are a Black person living in a Black community, you're more willing to want technology than human if the error is going to be the what we've seen thus far.
Michael, if you'd like, I can provide a little bit of perspective on the appraisal profession in terms of the availability for minorities to enter the profession. Many of you probably know that there has been a crisis in terms of the availability of people to replace appraisers in the appraisal profession. The average age of appraiser is pushing 60 years old, and there have been some significant challenges in getting the supervisor appraiser, and that's really kind of been the bottleneck. And we've been actively involved in trying to find some ways to get younger people involved in the profession, get them quality training so that they can deal with some of the valuation challenges that we have. The reality is I don't know a single appraiser who knows the ethnic makeup of the borrower and the seller when they get the assignment. It's certainly not a factor that is being used, and with the oversight that we have on the secondary market overview, it would be hard to go in and cherry pick comps based on ethnic makeup simply because we don't know in most cases the ethnicity of the buyers and sellers in comparable sale transactions. That aside, the reality is technology is a useful tool, but I have a hard time thinking that we're going to be able to replace the competent, qualified appraiser who is able to come in and analyze and report information about the physical characteristics of a property. We're having all kinds of trouble with some of these challenges that deal with standardizing. And as we all know, statistical models are only as good as the data we have available. And if we aren't able to filter and get quality data, our results suffer as a result. So there are certainly challenges that we have. And we do need to find ways to get more people involved. And I would love to see more ethnic diversity within the appraisal community, because Dr. Perry's absolutely right. It is primarily white, and it would be nice to get more people involved. I'm not aware of any restrictions other than the generic qualifications, but perhaps what we need to do is be reaching out and seeing if we can't make people aware of the opportunities that may be available, because I think it does benefit society as a whole to get more people involved. Thank you.
Elizabeth, was there anything that you wanted to add to any of this discussion?
Yeah, I think the one thing that I would add is this is critically imperative that we focus on increasing diversity across the profession, the entire housing industry, because it's not just about lack of access and a group of folks that have been historically discriminated against, but it is also about the future of where the real estate market is going. By 2045, Caucasians are not going to be the majority population. So when we think about the future of who is actually going to be the demographics of America, we have to prioritize this because that's where our future is going.
That's, I think that's a terrific way to end this conversation. I want to thank each of you, Dr. Perry, Mr. Morley, and Ms. Peets, for your insightful comments, for your time, and for your contributions out of the wealth of the hard work that each of you have been doing. I also want to thank Vince Malta and the NAR team for taking on this very important topic and having the courage to really stand up in this moment. And I want to thank all of you who signed in to listen. I hope that you got a lot of good information out of this. I know I did. And I look forward to hopefully interacting with you at a future event. Thank you very much, everyone, and have a good rest of your evening and a good rest of the day.